It was not a sound, but a resonance. A deep, thrumming chord that struck through the marrow of her bones and sang out in the vast, vaulted throne room. For one crystalline moment, the world stopped. The murmur of the assembled court, the distant hiss of torches, the rustle of silk and velvet, all of it fell away, leaving only the singular, ringing note of connection. Elara felt it as a sudden, impossible warmth spreading from the center of her chest, a sun blooming in the hollow space beneath her ribs. Her gaze, which had been fixed on the polished marble floor, lifted, pulled by a force as undeniable as gravity. It found him. King Caitian. He stood on the dais, a figure carved from shadow and moonlight. The ancient crown of the night caught a jagged circlet of obsidian on his brow. The bond, this myth, this legend whispered by hopeful humans and scornful vampires alike, had chosen him. And it had chosen her, a librarian's daughter from a forgotten provincial town, brought to the capital as part of the annual human tithe. Across the cavernous space that separated them, his silver eyes, usually as cool and remote as distant stars, were wide. He felt it too. She knew he did. The shock was a mirror, reflecting her own disbelief back at her. A shared silence, a shared breath in a room full of people. It was the most intimate thing she had ever known. Hope, terrifying and brilliant, surged through her. This was the promise of the bond, a perfect seeing, a perfect knowing. An end to loneliness. Then, it broke. The moment shattered like glass. Caitian's expression, so briefly open, shuttered closed. A mask of cold, imperial indifference slammed down, so swift and total it was as if the flicker of connection had never happened. He straightened his shoulders, the motion subtle but absolute. His gaze slid from her, dismissing her, erasing her, moving on to the Duke of Ashfall who stood beside him. He inclined his head, a gesture of regal consultation, and the world rushed back in. The Duke bowed. The court stirred, their whispers returning, now sharp and venomous. The warmth in Elara's chest turned to ice. The sun that had bloomed there collapsed into a tiny, dense point of pain. He had felt it. He had felt the single greatest miracle of their two peoples, the thing poets wrote of and historians chronicled, and he had turned his back on it. On her. She stood frozen, a statue of humiliation in the center of the great hall. Every eye was on her now, not with awe, but with a horrifying, dissecting pity. She was a curiosity. A scandal. The human girl who had forged a bond with a king who clearly wanted nothing to do with her. Her dress, a simple thing of dark blue wool, felt coarse and plain amidst the court splendor. Her hands, clasped before her, began to tremble. She wanted to run, to disappear, to melt into the cold stone floor, but her feet were rooted to the spot. The bond, which a moment ago had felt like a golden thread of light, now felt like a chain, tethering her to the source of her shame. From the corner of her eye, she could see him, still standing on the dais, a portrait of unbothered sovereignty. He did not look at her again. He did not have to. The message had been sent, received not just by her, but by every vampire, every courtier, every servant in the room. She was nothing. The silence around her became a physical pressure, the weight of 1,000 unspoken judgments. They saw her as an anchor, a weakness foisted upon their eternal, unassailable king. A human stain on his immaculate reign. The pain in her chest was no longer a point, but a sprawling, aching void. It was the feeling of a door being slammed shut in her face, the echo of the latch clicking into place reverberating through every part of her. A guard, his face impassive, eventually approached her. His voice was low, devoid of inflection. "This way, my lady." The title was a mockery, a bitter twist of the knife. He led her from the throne room, her steps stiff and graceless. The eyes of the court followed her, a physical weight on her back. She did not look back at the dais. She could not bear to see the king's profile, his perfect, cruel indifference. As the great oaken doors closed behind her, cutting off the torchlight and the whispers, she was left with only two things: the chilling silence of the empty corridor, and the agonizing, one-sided hum of a bond that sang only of rejection. 6 days now. 6 days since she had been escorted to these opulent chambers, a gilded cage where she was left to slowly, quietly suffocate. The rooms were beautiful, of course. The bed was draped in silks the color of a bruised twilight, the carpets were thick and soft, and a fire was always lit in the marble hearth, its flames doing nothing to warm the profound chill that had settled deep within her. Meals arrived on silver trays, untouched. Gowns of impossible beauty were laid out by silent maids, unworn. It was the careful, meticulous hospitality one might afford a guest of immense importance or a prisoner on the verge of execution. Ilara wasn't sure which she was. The bond was a constant, physical presence. It was a low, persistent ache behind her sternum, a phantom limb that reached for something that was not there. Sometimes, it would flare without warning. A sudden, sharp spike of irritation, not her own, would lance through her while she was staring out the window at the perpetually grey sky. A wave of profound, weary exhaustion would wash over her in the middle of the afternoon, making her limbs feel like lead. They were his emotions, she knew. Faint, distorted echoes of the king's inner world, bleeding through the connection he refused to acknowledge. They were phantom pains, ghosts of a conversation they would never have. He was avoiding her with a diligence that was, in itself, a form of attention. She learned his rhythms through the whispers of the bond. She knew when he was in counsel, the irritation sharpening to a fine, angry point. She knew when he was in the training yards, a thread of controlled violence humming beneath the surface. And she knew when he was alone, late at night, when a vast and ancient loneliness would seep through the cracks in his armor, an emotion so akin to her own that it made the ache in her chest unbearable. It was a cruel intimacy, to feel his solitude but be denied his presence. The court had taken its cue from its king. In the few, terrifying instances she had dared to venture from her rooms, she was met with a wall of perfect, polite disregard. Courtiers' eyes would slide past her as if she were a piece of furniture. Conversations would halt as she approached, resuming only after she had passed. They did not insult her. They did not threaten her. They simply rendered her invisible, a far more devastating cruelty. She was a ghost haunting the edges of their glittering, eternal world. One afternoon, desperate for a space that did not feel like a velvet-lined tomb, she found her way to the Royal Library. It was a place she had dreamed of, a sanctuary of paper and ink. The scent of old parchment and leather was the closest thing to home she had found in this cold, stone fortress. The library was immense, a cathedral of books rising 3 stories high, with spiraling iron staircases and narrow balconies. It was also empty. She ran a trembling hand over the spines of the books, the familiar texture a small, solid comfort. Here, at least, was a silence that was peaceful, not punishing. She was reaching for a slim volume of poetry when a subtle shift in the bond made her freeze. It was not an emotion this time, but a sense of proximity. A quiet sharpening of the connection, a thrum of awareness that told her he was near. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She held her breath, listening. The library was silent, save for the whisper of the fire in the grand fireplace at the far end of the room. And then she saw him. Caitian was on one of the upper balconies, half hidden in the shadows. He wasn't looking at a book. He was looking down, directly at her. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone, but the bond told a different story. It pulsed with a complex, warring current of frustration, possessiveness, and something else, something that felt dangerously like longing. It was a torrent of feeling, all the more powerful for being so fiercely repressed. Her breath caught. This was it. He would come down. He would speak to her. He had to. The sheer force of his attention was a physical thing, pinning her in place. She waited, her entire being focused on that shadowed figure. Seconds stretched into an eternity. The hope that she had tried so hard to murder rose again, a stubborn, foolish weed. And then, as slowly as he had appeared, he stepped back. The shadows swallowed him whole. The intense pressure of the bond lessened, receding back to its dull, familiar ache. He was gone. He had been there, he had seen her, he had felt, whatever it was he had felt, and he had chosen, once again, to walk away. The book of poetry slipped from her numb fingers and fell to the floor with a soft, defeated thud. The sound echoed in the vast, silent library, the perfect punctuation to her utter and complete despair. The tears she had refused to shed for 6 days finally came, hot and silent, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. He would not claim her. He would not even speak to her. He would just watch her break from a distance, himself the architect of her pain. 3 weeks after her public humiliation, the unchanging gloom of the night court was pierced by an unexpected arrival. The Fae delegation. They came to renegotiate the ancient treaties that kept the peace along the shadowed borders of their respective kingdoms. Their entrance into the Grand Hall was not an arrival so much as an inundation of life. Where the vampires were all monochrome elegance, obsidian, silver, the crimson of a blood-red sash, the Fae were a riot of impossible color. Their clothes seemed spun from living things, the iridescent green of a beetle's wing, the deep blue of a twilight sky, the vibrant orange of a monarch butterfly. They moved with a fluid grace that was entirely different from the vampire's predatory stillness. They laughed, their voices like the chiming of small bells, a sound so out of place in the somber halls that it felt almost sacrilegious. Ilara watched from a shadowed alcove, a place she had learned to find in every public room. She had been commanded to attend, a quiet, unsigned note left on her breakfast tray. It was another of Caitian's cruelties, forcing her to be present, to be seen being ignored, a living testament to his rejection. The vampires of the court, arrayed in their severe finery, looked upon the Fae with expressions of thinly veiled disdain. They were too loud, too bright, too alive. Among the Fae, one figure drew her eye. He was not their leader, that was a silver-haired queen with eyes like chips of jade, but he stood near her, an advisor or emissary of some importance. He was tall, with hair the color of autumn leaves and skin warmed by a sun this kingdom had not seen in centuries. While his kin surveyed the hall with cheerful curiosity, his gaze was different. It was keen, observant, missing nothing. He noted the subtle power dynamics, the faint lines of tension around Caitian's mouth, the way the courtiers angled themselves toward the throne. And then, his eyes found her. It happened so quickly she almost missed it. His gaze swept the hall and, unlike every other person in this castle, it did not slide past her. It stopped. It lingered. There was no pity in his expression, no morbid curiosity. There was only interest. A quiet, thoughtful acknowledgement of her existence. He saw a person standing in the shadows, not a scandal. For a heartbeat, their eyes met across the room. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a simple gesture of greeting. It was so small, so insignificant, but it struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. In 3 weeks, no one had looked at her with such simple, uncomplicated recognition. The warmth of it was a shock to her system, like stepping into a sunbeam after an age in a cellar. She was so stunned that she didn't react, just stared, her heart giving a painful lurch. Caitian, from his throne, was welcoming the Fae Queen. His voice was a low, formal baritone, each word polished and precise. But through the bond, Ilara felt a discordant note. A sharp, irritated flicker, as brief as a spark from a flint. He had seen the exchange. He had seen the Fae stranger look at her, and he had seen her look back. The feeling was not jealousy, it was too cold for that. It was annoyance. The annoyance of a man who finds a crack in a prized piece of porcelain, a thing he has no use for but does not wish for anyone else to notice either. The Fae emissary's attention moved on, back to his queen and the formal proceedings, but the impression of his gaze remained with Ilara. It was a tiny seed of warmth planted in the frozen wasteland of her heart. Later, as the court moved toward the banquet hall, she felt a presence beside her. The acoustics in this hall are designed to make one man's voice sound like a god's, a pleasant voice observed, its tone light and conversational. She turned. It was him. The Fae with the autumn hair. He had fallen into step beside her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He smiled, and his eyes crinkled at the corners. They were the color of moss and earth. It's an effective tool of power. A bit theatrical for my taste. Ilara was so shocked that anyone was speaking to her, she couldn't find her voice. She just stared at him. He didn't seem to mind. "My name is Reese," he said, offering the information freely. He didn't ask for hers, didn't put any pressure on her at all. He just walked with her, shortening his long stride to match her hesitant steps. "I confess, I find your king impressive. Like a monument. Beautiful, ancient, and entirely unmoving." The description was so apt it startled a small, choked laugh from her. The sound was rusty, foreign in her own ears. Rhys's smile widened, pleased. Ah, so there is a voice in there. He looked at her, his expression gentle. He keeps you hidden in the shadows. A curious choice for something so clearly meant for the light. His words were a balm. He didn't know the story, not the details, but he saw the truth of her situation. He saw her. Before she could think of a reply, they reached the doors to the banquet hall. He paused, giving her a small, formal bow. I hope to see you again, he said, his moss-green eyes sincere. Then he moved on, rejoining his delegation, leaving Alara standing at the threshold, the echo of his kindness ringing in the air. For the first time in weeks, the ache in her chest was overshadowed by a different feeling entirely. A fragile, tentative flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope. She sought the library again the next day, not for the books, but for the quiet. It had become her only refuge. She was tracing the faded gold leaf on the spine of an old atlas when the scent of rain-soaked earth and fresh greenery cut through the dry, papery air. She didn't need to turn around. I was told I might find you here, Rhys said. His voice was soft, careful not to startle her. She turned slowly. He stood a respectful distance away, holding a single, perfect white rose. It was impossible. Nothing had bloomed in the palace's frozen gardens for a century. A small piece of home, he explained, noticing her stare. We Fae learn to carry our gardens with us. He stepped forward and offered it to her. His fingers were long and graceful, his knuckles unadorned. For the lady in the shadows. Hesitantly, she reached out and took it. The petals were cool and velvety against her skin, and the scent was intoxicatingly real. It was the most vibrant, living thing she had held in weeks. Thank you, she whispered, the words feeling clumsy on her tongue. You are Alara, he said. It wasn't a question. I asked one of the maids. They were reluctant to speak your name, as if it were a curse. I don't think it sounds like a curse. She looked down at the rose, unable to meet the directness of his gaze. To many here, it is. Because of the bond, he asked gently. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. He knew. Rhys raised a hand, a placating gesture. News of such a thing travels faster than wind, even to the summer courts. We heard of the miracle. We did not hear of the aftermath. His gaze was full of a soft, sorrowful understanding. He is a fool. The words were so simple, so direct. Not a political calculation, not a veiled pity, but a plain statement of fact. A dam inside Alara broke. She didn't cry, but the tension that had held her rigid for weeks gave way. Her shoulders slumped. He has his reasons, she said, the excuse tasting like ash in her mouth. The court, they would see a human bond as a weakness. A vulnerability in their eternal king. To be vulnerable is to be alive, Rhys countered softly. What is a king who is afraid to live? He is a statue, as I said. A monument to his own fear. He gestured to a pair of worn leather armchairs near the fire. May I? She nodded, and they sat a day. The space between them felt comfortable, easy. He didn't press her for details. Instead, he spoke of his home, the sunken city of Eridor, a place of glowing moss and waterfalls that sang. He described the Fae concept of an Amkara, the soul friend, a connection of minds and hearts chosen freely, celebrated openly. It was a world away from the vampire's fated, cursed bond, a thing that happened to you, a chain of destiny. As he spoke, Alara felt herself uncurling, like a frostbitten leaf in the sun. She found herself talking, too. About her father's bookshop, the smell of ink and dust, the joy of a story well told. She spoke of things she thought she had forgotten. He listened. He truly listened, his head tilted, his moss-green eyes focused on her with an intensity that made her feel like the only person in the world. And then she felt it. A cold spike through the bond, sharp and unwelcome. Caitian. He was somewhere in the castle, his attention snagged by this moment. She could feel his focus like a physical weight, a cold pressure at the back of her neck. It was a distant, possessive anger. The anger of a collector who sees a stranger admiring a piece he has kept locked away in a dusty attic. Rhys must have seen the change in her expression. What is it? He asked, his voice laced with concern. Nothing, she lied, her voice tight. A chill. But Rhys's gaze was perceptive. He glanced around the cavernous library, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he could sense the unseen observer. "This castle is full of them," he said, his voice dropping lower. Cold draughts and colder eyes. He leaned forward slightly, his warmth a shield against the phantom chill. "He does not deserve the worry you give him, Elara." His use of her name, so natural and warm, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the king. He was right. She looked at Rhys, at his open face and kind eyes, and then at the perfect white rose she still held in her hand. For the first time, the ache of the bond was not the loudest thing in her heart. It was being rivaled by the quiet, steady beat of a new and utterly terrifying possibility. A choice. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, one defined not by Caitian's absence but by Rhys's presence. He sought her out with a gentle persistence that brooked no argument. They did not speak again in the library, a space she now felt was tainted by the memory of Caitian's cold surveillance. Instead, Rhys drew her out of the shadows and into the world, or at least, the small, forgotten corners of it within the palace walls. He led her to the long-abandoned orrery, a vast room where brass and silver models of planets and stars gathered dust. With a touch, he coaxed them back to life, their gears turning without a sound, their celestial paths glowing with a soft, fey light. They stood in the center of their own private universe, and he told her the fey names for the constellations, stories of star-crossed lovers and heroic beasts, so different from the grim, warlike legends of the vampires. Another day, he found her in the glass-roofed menagerie, a place of sorrow where strange, pale creatures paced in gilded cages. While she mourned their captivity, Rhys simply sat with her, his silence a comforting presence. He did not offer easy platitudes. He just understood, sharing in her quiet grief for these beautiful, broken things. He had a way of seeing the world that stripped away pretense, that went straight to the heart of the matter. He saw her not as the king's rejected mate, but as a woman who felt deeply for caged things because she, too, was in a cage. With every shared moment, every quiet conversation, the fragile seed of hope he had planted began to sprout. He treated her with an open, unapologetic admiration that was as foreign to her as the fey tongue. He would compliment the deep blue of her dress, telling her it reminded him of the rare moon-petal flowers that bloomed in his homeland. He would notice when she'd braided her hair differently, his smile a small, private reward. These were tiny things, but in the barren landscape of her existence, they were everything. He was proud to be seen with her. When they walked the high colonnades overlooking the central courtyard, he did not shrink away if a vampire lord passed. He would meet their cold stares with a placid calm, his proximity to Elara a quiet, unyielding statement. The bond with Caitian became a source of constant, jarring dissonance. While she was laughing at a story Rhys told, a wave of icy fury would wash through her. Caitian, in some meeting, his patience wearing thin. While she and Rhys shared a companionable silence in the snow-dusted gardens, she would feel a pang of profound, gut-wrenching loneliness that was not her own. The king was a ghost at her feast, his misery a bitter spice in her first taste of happiness. It was this dissonance that made her bold. The constant intrusion, the feeling of being emotionally tethered to a man who wanted nothing to do with her physically, began to curdle from pain into resentment. The more time she spent with Rhys, the more she recognized Caitian's silence not as a political necessity, but as a personal failing. A cowardice. One evening, Rhys brought a small, hand-carved wooden flute to the battlements where she often went to watch the bleak sunset. He played a melody that was both mournful and hopeful, a tune that spoke of long journeys and eventual homecomings. As the last note faded into the wind, he looked at her, his expression serious. "My queen is growing impatient," he said softly. "The negotiations are stalling. Your king is distracted. He makes concessions he shouldn't, then refuses simple compromises. He is at war with himself." Elara hugged her arms, the cold of the stone seeping into her cloak. I know she could feel it. The chaotic push and pull of his emotions, the indecision, the frustration. "He watches you," Rhys continued, his gaze unwavering. "When you are with me, he watches." She nodded, the confession a weight in her throat. "I feel it." Rhys reached out, not to touch her, but just holding his hand in the space between them, an offer of comfort. This bond, It is not a gift, is it? It is a leash. The word struck her with the force of truth. A leash. That was exactly what it was. A way for him to keep her, to feel her, to own her from a distance, without ever having to bear the burden of standing beside her. The injustice of it burned, hot and sharp. He does not own you, Elara, Rhys said, as if reading her thoughts. Fate may have chosen the connection. But you, and you alone, choose what it means. His words hung in the air, a revolutionary thought. For weeks, she had been a passive victim of the bond, a ship tossed on the waves of Caitian's moods and the court's scorn. The idea that she had a choice, that she had any power at all, was terrifying and exhilarating. She looked at Rhys, his face illuminated by the dying light, his expression full of a faith in her that she did not have in herself. But perhaps, she thought, she could borrow his. Perhaps she could learn. The confrontation, when it came, was not in a grand hall or a shadowed library, but in the cold, sterile confines of her own chambers. She had returned from a walk with Rhys in the inner courtyard, the ghost of a smile still on her lips, the impossible white rose he had given her tucked into her sash. She opened the door and froze. Caitian was there. He stood before the fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece. He was not looking at the fire. He was looking at her. The full, undivided force of his attention was a physical shock. For weeks, she had seen him only from a distance, a remote figure on a dais, a shadow on a balcony. To have him here, in her space, was overwhelming. The bond, which had been a dull ache, now screamed between them, a high, keening thrum of proximity and tension. He was just as she remembered, impossibly tall, unnervingly still, his beauty as sharp and dangerous as a shard of ice. "Your Majesty," she breathed, sinking into a reflexive curtsy. It was absurd. He was in her rooms, uninvited, and she was the one showing deference. "Rise," he commanded. His voice was low and rough, as if he hadn't used it in some time. It sent a shiver down her spine, a response she hated. She rose slowly, her hands clasped before her to still their trembling. She could not read his expression. It was the same mask of cold control he wore for his court. But the bond was a maelstrom. It roiled with a dark, possessive anger that was so potent it made her feel dizzy. "You have been spending time with the Fey emissary," he stated. It was not a question. "His name is Rhys," she said, her voice barely a whisper. A muscle jumped in Caitian's jaw. "I know his name. He is a child, playing at politics in a court he does not understand. The Fey are not our friends. They are fickle, treacherous. What they offer with one hand, they take with the other. He has been kind to me," she said, the simple words a shield against his accusations. "Kindness is a currency," Caitian retorted, his voice dripping with cynicism. "He uses it to buy, what? Your confidence. Your loyalty. Do you think he sees you? He sees a tool. A way to unsettle the king of the Night Court. A weakness to be exploited." The hypocrisy of it was breathtaking. He, who had treated her as less than nothing, was accusing another of using her. A spark of anger, hot and clean, cut through her fear. "And what do you see, Your Majesty?" she asked, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "When you look at me, if you even deign to look at me." He finally moved, turning his head to fix her with his silver gaze. The intensity of it was like being pinned by a physical weight. "I see a complication I did not ask for. I see a threat to the stability of my throne. This bond," he said the word as if it were poison, "is a vulnerability my enemies will use. A human mate is a sign of weakness. It invites challenge. It puts my entire world, everything I have spent centuries building and protecting, at risk." He spoke of his world, his throne, his risk. There was no mention of her. No acknowledgement of her pain, her humiliation, her isolation. She was not a person in his equation. She was a variable, a problem to be managed. "So you chose to hide me," she said, the bitterness rising. "To pretend I don't exist. To let me wither in these rooms like a forgotten flower. Was that for the stability of your throne? Or was it for the stability of your pride?" His eyes flashed, a dangerous silver light. "You do not understand the burdens of this crown. "And you do not understand the burden of this bond," she cried, the words tearing from her, raw and ragged. "To be chained to someone who despises your very existence. To feel your loneliness, your anger, your weariness, every single day, and receive nothing but silence in return. You speak of burdens, but you have no idea. You have no idea what it has been like." He took a step toward her, his shadow falling over her. He was so close now she could see the flecks of black in his silver irises. "Stay away from the Fae," he commanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "He will offer you pretty words and promises he cannot keep. He will fill your head with fantasies. But when his queen has what she wants from me, he will leave. And you will be left here, with nothing." "I already have nothing," she shot back, her own voice rising to match his intensity. For a moment, they stood locked in a stalemate, the air crackling with unspoken rage and a pain so deep it had no words. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the mask slipped. She saw it in his eyes, a flicker of raw, agonizing conflict. A deep, profound regret. The bond surged with it, a wave of pure sorrow that stole her breath. But it was gone as quickly as it came. The mask was back in place. He had shown her a crack, a glimpse of the man behind the monument, only to seal it up again. He would not offer her comfort. He would not offer her an apology. He would only offer her a command. "I have warned you," he said, his voice flat and final. Then he turned and swept from the room, the door closing with a soft, definitive click behind him. Ilara stood trembling in the sudden silence, the ghost of his presence and the chaotic echo of his emotions still swirling in the air. He had finally spoken to her. And all he had done was try to cage her again. The midwinter solstice ball was the pinnacle of the Night Court's social calendar, a night of grim opulence and political maneuvering disguised as celebration. The great hall was transformed. Thousands of candles floated in the air, their flames casting a warm, flickering light that did little to dispel the cavernous chill. The vampires were in their finest, an assembly of beautiful, predatory creatures draped in velvet and jewels. Ilara stood once more in her customary alcove, a ghost in a borrowed gown of simple silver silk. Caitian had commanded her attendance. Another turn of the screw, another reminder of her place. He was on his throne, a remote and magnificent figure, the obsidian crown on his head seeming to drink the light from the room. He had not spoken to her since their confrontation, but the bond was a live wire between them, humming with a tense, angry awareness. She could feel his gaze on her, even when he was looking elsewhere. The Fae delegation was a splash of life in the sea of monochrome. They stood near the grand entrance, observing the somber festivities with a kind of detached amusement. Rhys was among them, his formal attire a deep forest green that made him stand out. His eyes found her in the shadows almost immediately, and he gave her a slow, reassuring smile that made her heart ache. The music began, a haunting, stately waltz. The floor filled with couples, moving with a fluid, predatory grace. Ilara watched, a silent observer on the edge of the world. And then, a path cleared. Rhys was walking toward her. A collective, silent breath was drawn by the court. Every eye turned. The whispers started, a sibilant hiss that spread through the hall like fire through dry grass. He was breaking every rule of their rigid society. He was approaching her. He stopped before her, the sounds of the hall seeming to fade into a dull roar. He ignored the stares, the whispers, his attention solely on her. "They say it is a great honor to be asked to dance by a Fae emissary," he said, his voice a low, private murmur in the public space. He extended a hand. "But I would say the honor is all mine, if you would grant it." Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. This was not a quiet conversation in a library. This was a statement. A public declaration. To take his hand would be an act of open defiance. It would be a choice, made in front of the entire court, and in front of the king. She glanced at the dais. Caitian was watching, his body unnaturally still, his face a mask of stone. But the bond was a silent scream. A tempest of raw, incandescent fury, possessiveness, and something that felt terrifyingly like pain surged through it, so powerful it made her physically recoil. It was the howl of a king watching his most private, discarded possession being claimed by another. For a moment, fear paralyzed her. The weight of Caitian's silent rage was a physical force. But then she looked back at Rhys. He was waiting patiently, his hand outstretched, his moss-green eyes full of steady, unwavering belief in her. He wasn't offering her a fantasy. He was offering her a choice. A chance to step out of the shadows. She put her trembling hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. A gasp went through the court. Rhys smiled, a brilliant, triumphant thing, and led her onto the dance floor. The other couples melted away, clearing a space in the center of the hall, leaving them in a circle of hostile, fascinated silence. The orchestra faltered, the musicians looking to their king for guidance. Caitian's gaze was locked on them. For a long, terrible moment, the hall was utterly silent, save for the crackling of the candles. Then, with a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, he commanded them to play. The music started again, but the waltz was different now. It was heavier, more somber, a dirge. Rhys pulled her close. "Breathe, Elara," he whispered, his hand firm on her back. "They cannot hurt you." He began to lead her through the steps of the waltz. She was clumsy at first, her body stiff with fear, her mind reeling from the assault of Caitian's emotions. But Rhys was a steady anchor in the storm. He guided her with a gentle confidence, his steps sure, his presence a warm shield. He looked only at her, his expression tender, as if they were the only two people in the universe. Slowly, the terror began to recede, replaced by a strange, heady exhilaration. She was here, in the center of the world that had tried to erase her. And she was not invisible. She was seen. She was claimed. She lifted her chin, meeting the cold, resentful stares of the court with a newfound strength. She let them look. She let them see her with this vibrant, brave man who was not ashamed of her. She dared a glance at the throne. Caitian had not moved. But the mask was cracking. She could see the fine lines of tension around his eyes, the white-knuckled grip he had on the arm of his throne. And through the bond, she felt the full, undiluted force of his inner chaos. It was not just anger anymore. It was regret. A vast, black ocean of it. The regret of a man who had only just realized the value of what he had thrown away, now that it was in another's hands. The pain of it was sharp, a knife twisting in her own heart, a shared agony. But beneath the pain, there was something else. A flicker of triumph. He was feeling what she had felt for weeks, the agony of watching from a distance, powerless to intervene. The dance ended. Rhys held her for a moment longer than was proper, then bowed low, his lips brushing her knuckles. It was a gesture of profound respect, of open admiration. And it was the final, unforgivable insult to the king. The political situation, already tense, fractured. The dance was the catalyst, the public spectacle that Caitian's enemies had been waiting for. The old, powerful houses, the Duke of Ashfall, the matriarch of the Onyx Vein, saw the king's inaction at the ball not as restraint, but as weakness. His human mate, once a whispered scandal, was now an open wound, and the Fey emissary was the salt being rubbed into it. Whispers of challenge grew into open murmurs in the council chambers. A king ruled by a human affection, distracted by a foreign dalliance, he was compromised. The stability he prized above all else was crumbling, and by his own hand. Caitian reacted with the cold, brutal pragmatism that had kept him on the throne for 500 years. He withdrew. The court became a place of locked doors and silent, meaningful glances. The negotiations with the Fae stalled completely. Rhys was confined to the emissary's wing, his access to the palace restricted. Elara was once again a prisoner in her rooms, but this time, there were guards outside her door. They were there for her protection, she was told. She knew they were there to keep her in. The bond was a torment. Caitian's emotions were a chaotic storm of cold fury, strategic calculation, and flashes of a deep, agonizing regret that he immediately suppressed. He was a man cornered, and a cornered king was the most dangerous creature in the world. 2 days after the ball, he summoned her. Not to her chambers, not to the throne room, but to his private solar, a stark, masculine room dominated by a massive oak desk covered in maps and treaties. The air was cold, smelling of old paper and ozone. He did not ask her to sit. He stood by the tall, arched window, looking out at the bleak, snow-swept courtyard. "The council is demanding a resolution," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. He did not turn to look at her. "They see the bond as an infection that threatens the crown. They see your association with the Fae as an act of treason." "I have done nothing," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I have only existed." "In this court," he replied, a bitter edge to his tone, "that is often enough. They have given me an ultimatum. Formally renounce you and the bond, and have you exiled. Or face a challenge for the throne." Ilara's heart went cold. Renounced. Exiled. The words were stones dropping into a deep, dark well. After everything, after the dance, after that flicker of regret she had felt from him, this was his solution. To cast her out. "So you will send me away," she stated, the lack of feeling in her own voice surprising her. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean of hope. "There is another way," he said, and he finally turned. His face was pale, his silver eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "A political solution. One that would placate the council, solidify the treaty with the Fae, and ensure your safety." She waited, a sense of dread coiling in her stomach. "The Fae Queen has long desired a permanent foothold in the north," he explained, his tone that of a general outlining a battle strategy. "A trade outpost, a formal embassy within our walls. It is a concession I have always refused. I will grant it to her. And as a gesture of goodwill, to seal this new, unprecedented alliance." He paused, his gaze unblinking. "I will offer you to her. To be fostered in her court. You would be given a position of honor. You would be safe. And the emissary, Rhys, he would be your guardian." The room tilted. The air rushed from her lungs. He wasn't exiling her. He wasn't renouncing her. He was giving her away. Like a piece of property. A gilded, breathing treaty clause. He would use her affection for Rhys, the very thing that had driven him to this precipice, as the mechanism of his political salvation. He would turn her heart's tentative hope into a transaction. "You would trade me," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Like a parcel of land. A bag of coin. "I would be securing your future," he snapped, his control finally breaking. A flash of raw frustration crossed his face. "Do you think I want this? The Fae will treat you better than my own court ever would. You will have a life there, a life you could never have here. You would be with him." He said the word with a venomous disgust that was startling. "Is that not what you want?" "What I want." Her voice rose, shaking with a grief and a fury so profound it felt like it would tear her apart. "What I have wanted, from the very first moment, was for you to look at me. To see me. Not as a complication, not as a threat, not as a political pawn to be bartered away, but as the other half of this bond you so despise." Tears streamed down her face, hot and angry. "You have never once asked me what I want. You have only ever told me what I am to you. A burden. A weakness. And now, a gift. A tool to save your precious throne." She took a ragged breath, the final, brittle pieces of her heart breaking. "You are a coward, Caitian. A magnificent, eternal, and pathetic coward. You would rather trade away your soul than admit you have 1 inch. He flinched as if she had physically struck him. The silence that followed was absolute, filled only by the sound of her own choked breathing. He stared at her, his mask shattered, his face a canvas of pure, unadulterated agony. He had made his choice. He had chosen his crown, his power, his cold and lonely solitude. And in doing so, he had revealed the truth. He was not a king trapped by duty. He was a prisoner of his own fear. And he had just tried to lock her in a different cage to save himself. The decision settled in her not with a crash, but with a quiet, chilling clarity. It was the calm at the heart of the storm, a point of absolute stillness where grief and fury coalesced into resolve. She was not a gift to be given. She was not a treaty to be signed. Her life, her heart, her choice, they were her own. He had made his choice, and now she would make hers. She wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand, a gesture devoid of her usual timidity. She felt a strange, cold power settle over her, the strength of someone with nothing left to lose. She looked at Caitian, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she felt no fear. Only a vast, bottomless pity. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it resonated in the cold air with the finality of a death knell. Caitian's brow furrowed in confusion. "No. No," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "I am not a concession in your treaty. I am not a gesture of goodwill. I reject your solution, I reject your offer. I reject this arrangement. My future is not yours to secure." She saw the flicker of disbelief in his eyes, the shock of a king whose commands have never been questioned. He had expected tears, arguments, perhaps even a grateful acceptance of the gilded cage he was offering. He had not expected this. This quiet, unshakable refusal. "You don't understand, Elara," he began, taking a step toward her, his tone laced with a desperate urgency. "This is the only way. The council is ready to move against me. Ashfall will challenge. There will be blood. War. Then that is a war of your own making," she countered, standing her ground. "The consequences of your own choices. You will not use me to avoid them." She took a deep breath. "I will be leaving the night court. But I will not be going as your political offering. I will be going with Rhys because I choose to. And I will be going as a free woman." His face paled. "What do you mean?" "This bond," she said, and for the first time, she placed a hand over her own heart, over the place where the connection ached. "It is a chain. You said it yourself. A vulnerability. And I will not be your vulnerability any longer. Nor will I be shackled to a man who would sell me to save himself." She met his gaze, and held it. "I am ending it." The full import of her words sank in. To willfully sever a soul bond was unheard of. It was an act of metaphysical violence, a self-mutilation said to be unendurable, the pain capable of shattering a mind. Caitian stared at her, his silver eyes wide with a dawning horror. "You can't," he whispered. "The pain, it will destroy you. Being bound to you is already destroying me," she replied, her voice utterly calm. "This will be a cleaner death." Without another word, she turned and walked out of his solar, leaving him standing in the cold light of the window, his perfect political solution in ruins around him. She went directly to the Fae delegation's wing. The vampire guards at her door made a move to stop her, but she fixed them with a look of such cold, absolute authority that they fell back, confused. She found Rhys in the antechamber, pacing like a caged wolf. He stopped when he saw her, his face a mask of worry. "Elara," he breathed, rushing to her. "They told me you were summoned. I feared." "Rhys," she interrupted, her voice steady. "I have made a choice. I am choosing you. But I must do something first. And I will need you with me." She led him to the great hall. It was empty now, a cavern of shadow and echo. She walked to the center of the room, to the very spot where the bond had first formed, the place of her initial humiliation. She turned to face the dais, the empty throne a silent monument to the man who was not there. "It is said that a bond forged in public must be broken in public," she said, more to herself than to Rhys. An act of will, witnessed. She closed her eyes, gathering her strength. She could feel Caitian's panic through the bond now, a frantic, desperate scrabbling as he realized what she was about to do. He was coming. He was racing through the castle, his terror a tidal wave crashing against her mind. "Don't," the silent plea screamed through the connection. "Elara, please." She ignored it. She focused inward, finding the golden thread of the bond where it was woven into the fabric of her soul. It was warm, alive, a part of her. Tearing it out would be like tearing out her own heart. She thought of Rhys, of his kindness, of his belief in her. She thought of a future where she was not a ghost, not a burden, not a commodity. A future where she was simply herself. She took a deep, shuddering breath and pulled. The pain was absolute. It was not a cut or a tear, but an implosion. A supernova of agony that detonated in the center of her being, vaporizing everything in its path. A scream was ripped from her throat, raw and animalistic. The world dissolved into a blinding white light of pure suffering. She felt the thread snap, the severance of violent, metaphysical recoil that threw her to her knees. The warmth in her chest vanished, replaced by a void so vast and cold it was a wonder she still existed. She was falling, tumbling into an endless, empty darkness. Just before she was lost completely, she felt strong arms wrap around her. She felt herself lifted. She smelled the scent of rain-soaked earth and living green things, a promise of life in the face of oblivion. Rhys. He was holding her. He was murmuring her name, his voice a lifeline in the silent, screaming void. The last thing she felt before consciousness fled was the ghost of another's pain, a distant, shattered echo of a king on his knees, howling in an agony he had never believed he could feel, finally and utterly alone. Consciousness returned in fragments. A feeling of movement, the gentle rocking of a carriage. The scent of lavender and cedar. The texture of soft wool against her cheek. She opened her eyes, and the world was a blur of green and brown, the dappled light of a forest canopy seen through a carriage window. The ache was the first thing she was truly aware of. It was a hollow, cavernous emptiness in her chest, where the bond had been. It was not the sharp, intrusive pain of before, but a clean, profound absence. The phantom limb was gone, and the silence it left behind was both a relief and a grief. "You're awake." She turned her head. Rhys was sitting on the opposite bench, watching her. His face was etched with concern, but his moss-green eyes were soft. She was lying on a makeshift bed, her head on a pile of cloaks. His cloak was draped over her. "How long?" she whispered, her throat raw. 2 days, he answered. "We left immediately. My queen was accommodating. Once I explained." He paused. "Caitian did not try to stop us." The name sent a shiver through her, but it was a memory of a chill, not the thing itself. The bond was truly gone. She could no longer feel him, no longer sense his rage or his sorrow. The silence was vast. "What happened?" she asked, sitting up slowly. Her body felt weak, fragile, like old glass. "You severed the bond," Rhys said, his voice full of a quiet awe. "I have never seen such a thing. Such an act of will. The force of it threw him back. When I carried you from the hall, he was on the floor. He didn't even see us leave. He was just broken." Elara looked down at her hands. They were steady. She had done it. She had torn out a piece of her own soul, and she had survived. The emptiness was there, a scar she would carry forever, but it was her own. It was not his. The pain, she began, was immense. Rhys finished for her, his expression somber. "But it is over. The wound will heal, Elara. In time. It will leave a scar, but scars are just proof that we can heal." She looked at him, at his earnest, kind face. He had been her anchor. He had held her when she was shattering, and he had carried her out of the ruins of her old life. He had not saved her, she had saved herself, but he had been there, a steady presence that made her own courage possible. They traveled for weeks. They left the blighted lands of the Night Court behind, the perpetual twilight giving way to true dawns and vibrant sunsets. Elara watched the world come back to life in color. She saw green fields, blue skies, trees with leaves of gold and red. Each new sight was a balm to her wounded spirit. Rhys was a patient companion. He did not press her to talk. He simply existed beside her, sharing his food, pointing out landmarks, and sometimes, in the evenings by the fire, playing his soft, hopeful melodies on his wooden flute. He gave her space to grieve the part of herself she had lost, and space to discover the person who remained. She found she was quieter than she had been, but stronger. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was gone, burned away in the fire of her final choice. One evening, they stopped by a clear, fast-running river. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Elara knelt by the water's edge, watching her own reflection. The face that looked back was hers, but different. Thinner, paler, with shadows under the eyes, but her gaze was clear. It was her own. Rhys came to stand beside her. He didn't speak for a long time, just watched the river with her. "He chose his crown," she said finally, the words soft, without their old bitterness. It was just a fact now. "He chose his prison." "Yes," Rhys said. "And you chose freedom." She looked up at him. "You were proud to be seen with me," she said. "Even when I was a disgrace." "Why?" He considered the question for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. Because I saw no disgrace, he answered simply. I saw a woman of immense strength and quiet dignity, trapped in a cage she did not build. I saw someone who deserved to be seen, to be cherished. It was not pride, Ilara. It was just respect. He reached out then, his movements slow, giving her time to pull away. But she didn't. He gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. His touch was warm, real, a stark contrast to the phantom sensations of the bond. It was a connection offered, not forced. A choice, not a destiny. The past is a scar, he whispered, his eyes searching hers. But the future can be a garden. If we are willing to tend it. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of pain. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking relief. The relief of being truly, finally seen for who she was. She leaned into his touch, a silent, willing surrender not to him, but to the possibility of a new beginning. He smiled, a slow, gentle thing, and his hand slipped down to take hers. His fingers interlaced with her own, a quiet, solid promise. It was not the searing, fated resonance of the bond. It was something far quieter, and infinitely more precious. It was the start of a conversation. And as they stood by the river, the last light of the sun fading around them, she felt the first, tentative roots of a new life taking hold in the empty spaces of her heart, a garden waiting to be grown.